Welcome back to another U.S. immigration law video. In this video today, we are going to be discussing TN visa application process and the TN application process specifically for Canadians and the options that Canadians have either to apply directly at a land port or a land border, driving across the border to the United States, or flying to the United States through what is called pre-clearance or pre-flight inspection. And the difference between those two processes and what might impact your decision on whether or not you want to fly to the United States or you want to drive to the United States. So when you're discussing pre-flight inspection or pre-clearance versus the land border, it's important to understand where you're making your application when you're applying for TN status as a Canadian. If you are applying for TN status and you're at Pearson, for example, you are in Canada. You are inside Canada with a pre-clearance station that has been authorized through agreement, and it's called the Preclearance Act between Canada and the United States that allows U.S. Customs and Border Protection to do inspections on Canadian soil before Canadians seek entry to the United States. And because this application process takes place in Canada, there are certain legal protections that are afforded to those applicants that you might not have if you're doing your inspection at a land port. Why? Because a land port is actually in the United States. If you've ever come into the United States by land, pay attention. When you hit the customs booth, you're already in the United States. You've already crossed the international boundary and you are now in the United States. Even though you haven't been officially admitted, you are on U.S. soil. So that's a big difference to understand when you're applying for TN status at an airport versus applying at a land port in the United States. Now, what are the additional rights that you have as a Canadian if you're applying through pre-flight inspection or pre-clearance? Well, you are in Canadian soil, so it limits what a CBP officer can do because you are still in Canada. You have the right to withdraw your application if you are doing it through pre-clearance. If in the process you feel like the application is going south and you do not want to move forward with your application, you can ask to withdraw your application and you have the right to do so. Canadian laws apply to you. So any search or detention has to comply with Canadian standards as well. And for the most part, they can't detain you because you are not on U.S. soil. When you're applying through pre-clearance, you are still in Canada when you're going through this process. And it also limits the force that CBP officers can use, and all of this has to be done according to Canadian standards. So when you're going through pre-clearance, you would go through the check-in process and security at the airport like you normally would. You would proceed to the pre-clearance area in the airport for CBP, and you would present your application to the border officer there, the CBP officer. And then they would review your documentation on the spot before you board your flight. So you need a boarding pass even to get to that point. So that's one of the complications when you do choose to fly and be inspected pre-flight is you have to pay for a boarding pass and you have to be seeking entry to the United States that day on an airplane in order to be inspected. But you do have those rights. You do have the right to withdraw. They don't have the right to detain you, not for immigration purposes. They can refuse your entry. They can deny you. They can give you a bar or a ban for entry to the United States that would make it very difficult for you to re-enter, even if you're applying through pre-clearance. However, that detention fear that a lot of people have because of certain cases in the media, well, if you're applying through pre-clearance, you have protections that are afforded to you because you are still on Canadian soil. Now, if you're coming by land port, you give up certain rights. And this applies to everyone too at a land port. It also applies to U.S. citizens. You're subject to search and you are subject to detention if what you're doing would warrant a detention. You're subject to removal from the United States. And if you refuse to cooperate, CBP can take actions that they couldn't at a pre-clearance station, such as detaining you. and they could give you what is called a notice to appear before a judge to hear your case. So there are certain things that can happen at a land port that wouldn't happen through pre-clearance. And it's just important to understand what your rights are, because one, you're in Canada, and the other, you're in the United States. Now, in any event, and it's very important to understand, whether you're doing this at a land port or you're doing it at pre-clearance, if you're refused, it's put in the system. So just because you applied through pre-clearance doesn't mean that you're not going to have the same immigration consequences. If you are committing fraud, you're committing fraud, whether it's in the US or in Canada. It'll be noted in the CBP system. If you are applying with faulty documents, it'll be noted in the system. They will note your answers to questions. They will document everything heavily, whether it's through the airport or through a land port. And the same immigration consequences would apply whether it's through pre-clearance or at a land border. So you're not avoiding immigration consequences. However, you are avoiding how they can handle those immigration consequences if you are in Canada and doing it through pre-clearance. So it's a very important distinction to understand, that you're not just foregoing any immigration consequences. If you refuse to cooperate and withdraw your application at pre-clearance, well, good luck coming back into the United States. They're gonna note your record. They're gonna note what their thoughts were when you withdrew your application, and it's gonna be very difficult for you to come back to the United States for any purpose at that point. So just because you have additional protections as far as detention and removal goes, doesn't mean that you escape immigration consequences. But in the end, it's helpful to understand, one is being done in Canada and the other is being done on US soil. And because of that, the CBP officers at a land port have additional measures that they can take if it's warranted, where if you're doing it through pre-clearance in Canada, you are protected by Canadian laws as well that afford you more rights than you have at a land port in the United States. So if you have a complex case or situation, you might want to consider where you're applying through. If you have a complicated immigration history, or if you have a TN application and you're applying for an occupation that could be a difficult one, then you might want to consider a land port, or you might want to consider an airport versus a land port. You also might want to consider filing in advance with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services altogether before applying at either a land port or through pre-clearance. If you have any questions about TN application process and that strategy, whether you should do pre-clearance or whether you should do a land port or whether you should get pre-approval with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, we advise clients and Canadians on these issues on a daily basis. So we can definitely advise you for the proper scenario for your situation and your qualifications for TN status and which approach would be best for your situation. Any other questions, feel free to reach out to us directly. We'd be glad to help with your TN questions or any U.S. immigration related matters. Thank you for tuning in to another video, and have a great day.